was a great one. But at the same time, it's a very convicting thing. So if you'll turn to Isaiah chapter 5, and I'm going to direct you to a couple of other places as we go through here. We're also going to be looking in John 15 and in Mark 11. So if you got enough fingers to put them in all of those places, we will hop around just a little bit. This particular passage that we're going to read out of Isaiah 5, 1 through 7 is called the Song of the Vineyard. Vineyards are big things in Israel and the surrounding area there. Lots of places, and you'll be out in the middle of nowhere, and it looks like arid desert, and then all of a sudden you will see this beautiful green plot that might be the size of this building, or it might be the size of a football field. But the interesting thing that you see, when you see that plot, you see a row of rocks all around it that surround that particular little vineyard out there, or whatever it is that they're growing in that particular plot. And you think about the parable of the soils, when before they could plant, they had to get the rocks out of there. And what they would do with those rocks is they would just outline their plot that they're growing. And beautiful. Evidently, the people in Israel have a wonderful, wonderful understanding of irrigation, because how they get water into places like that, I don't know. But somehow or another they do, and it makes a big difference there. But let's read together these first 7 verses in chapter 5. I will sing about the one I love, a song about my loved one's vineyard. The one I love had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He broke up the soil, cleared it of stones, and planted it with the finest vines. He built a tower in the middle of it and even dug out a wine press there. He expected it to yield good grapes, but it yielded worthless grapes. So now, residents of Jerusalem and men of Judah, please judge between me and my vineyard. What more could I have done for my vineyard than I did? Why, when I expected a yield of good grapes, did it yield worthless grapes? Now I will tell you what I'm about to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will tear down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland. It will not be pruned or weeded. Thorns and briars will grow up. I will also give orders to the clouds that the rain should not fall on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of armies is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah the plant he delighted in. He expected justice, but saw injustice. He expected righteousness, but heard cries of despair. Oh my goodness. Well, let's kind of break this down a little bit and find out some things about it. The point that is made is that God planted and cultivated a vineyard which did not bear good fruit. It did not produce what he anticipated that it would and what he wanted it to produce. There is a clear warning here that fruit is expected from our lives. Failure to bear fruit also bears some dire consequences, and we need to be aware of that. So let's look just a moment at God's work and his expectations. In the first part of this, it says that God broke up the soil, cleared it of stones, and planted it with the finest vines. The parable of the soils, of course, that we talked about just a few moments ago in Matthew 13, about the fact that if it is not good ground, it is not going to give a good production of fruit or whatever it is that has been done there. Then it says he built a tower in the middle of it. Do you know what that means? That means this was a large vineyard. And it meant that he had to have the tower so he could get up on the tower and he could see all the way around his vineyard. He could see if the wall was broken down at any place where anybody could get in there. He could see if anybody was sneaking into the vineyard to get anything. So this was not just a small vineyard. This was a large vineyard that had to have the tower. Not all vineyards have towers. Not all of them are that big. Some of them are little family plots, if you will. and they don't need all of that. He also dug a wine press there. Now, let me tell you about wine presses. I saw a wine press in the area where the garden tomb is when we visited that. And let me tell you what's involved with a wine press. First, there is a collection area. The collection area is where once they go in and they reap the grapes, they come and they dump them in this collection area. And it's a big area. It's usually a large flat area near the wine press. And then there is a treading floor. And that's the picture that you always have about wine presses, right? The treading floor where the people get in there barefoot and jump up and down on the grapes, tromp around on the grapes. It's a large area. It's normally covered by mosaics where the grapes are laid and crushed by the feet of the workers extracting the juice. And the juice, together with the crushed grapes, were left for preliminary fermentation. So they don't just take them out right away. They crush them and they kind of leave them in there. And they don't use shoes because they don't want to crush the grape seeds, because that would make the grapes or the wine bitter. There is a small hole in the middle of the treading floor, and that is for secondary crushing of the grapes. They can get it up to the small hole, and they have something like a pestle. You know what a pestle is? If you're a pharmacist, you do. A mortar and a pestle. It's something that would grind a little bit more. It's a bigger thing than most of the pestles that we see. And they actually have a kind of a fixed screw thing on it where they can screw it down really, really tight and make it press out some more of juice from the grape skins and the stalks and everything after treading. Then there is an optional pinhole on the side of the floor that provides a place for some of this to go in, and a pipe or canal then that lets the grape juice flow down from the collecting pool through a filter. And they have a filter there that filters out the skins and all that kind of stuff. There's a filter hole that is first used to block the juice during the fermentation process, but then to let only the juice flow while the grape shell and the pits remain on the treading floor. Then there is a collecting pool. Now, we've seen three levels: collection area, treading floor, collection pool that we're coming down to now. And in the collecting pool is where the juice is accumulated, and it undergoes a second fermentation process. And again, they decorate the floors, and this would depend upon the individual family or tribe or group. They would have special mosaic things that they would have there. The pool is lower than the treading floor, so the juice flows down into the pool. And then there are steps that lead down to the bottom of the pool. That's used by the workers to go in and collect the juice into jars for the storing. So you see, when you talk about a wine press, you're not talking about just a simple thing. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Look at all that God went through in preparation for getting good grapes. He did all of this. He prepared the land by removing the rocks and making sure that the thorns and thistles and everything else were removed from there. He planted the vines. He built the tower. He created the wine press. We're talking years of preparation before there was ever a grape grown. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? All that he went through to be able to do that. God expected from the inhabitants of Jerusalem and Judah, these were his vineyard, he expected good grapes, but instead the yield was worthless grapes. Now turn with me, if you will, over to John chapter 15. And let's look at the very first verse, and we'll come back to this a little bit later. But for right now, let's look at the first 2 or 3 verses here. Jesus speaking, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Every branch in me that does not produce fruit, he removes, and he prunes every branch that produces fruit so that it will produce more fruit." God is willing to do the work. God is the gardener. He's not expecting us necessarily to do the work. One of the things that we have to become aware of is the fact that we are called to bear fruit. We're not called to produce fruit, although there is a passage in John 15 that says something about producing fruit. But the fruit is produced by the combination of the roots that go down into the soil and get nutrients from there, the water and the sunshine, and the health of the vine to which the branches are attached. The branches are just, as one writer said, fruit racks. They're just the things out there that God hangs the fruit from. And it's important for us to recognize that. God is always willing to do the work. We have to recognize that, most of you know this, salvation is a gift, it's not a wage. God does not give us salvation in repayment for the work that we do. He gives us salvation in response to the faith that we have in Him. And He gives it to us as a free gift. He only implores us to receive it. Now, turn over to Mark 11, and I want you to see something here in verse 12. Jesus and His guys were staying outside of Jerusalem. This is before the Feast of the Passover. And they were staying outside of Jerusalem, and every day they were going into the town, into the city. And so on this particular day, let's look at what happened. The next day, verse 12, when they went out from Bethany, He was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree with leaves, He went to find out if there was anything on it. When He came to it, He found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. Let's stop there. We'll look at the rest of it a little bit later. I don't know much about figs, except my brother had a fig tree in his backyard. And that one little fig tree grew some great, luscious fruit. I mean, it was sweet. My goodness, you wouldn't need candy if you had figs, I'm telling you. Sweet as it could be. But here's the thing I understand about fig trees. When fig trees are in leaf, they usually have figs on them. When fresh, new leaves have grown out. And so Jesus saw this at a distance. He wasn't right on it. Seeing in the distance a fig tree with leaves. Jesus was not an agronomist. Jesus was what? A carpenter. He sees that, though, and common lore of his society says fig tree, leaves, fruit. So he goes over there. He's hungry. Can you imagine Jesus beginning to salivate as he gets closer to that fig tree? I mean, he's ready to eat, bud. This is breakfast. You know, breakfast means you've had a fast for the last 8 or 10 hours, ever how long you've been asleep. Now you wake up and you're going to break your fast. Jesus is going to break his fast, and he's headed for that fig tree, and he's really anticipating luscious figs. And he gets there, and he parts the branches, and there are no figs. Wow. It was not what he was expecting. So what did he do? Let's look at the next verse and see what he did. He said to it, and I don't think he yelled. I don't think he even spoke in a Charlton Heston voice. But he said, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. First place, it's a little weird to talk to trees, don't you think? And I imagine they sort of scratched their heads as they went on into the city. But Jesus, the thing that we need to be aware of is that Jesus has no patience with those who put on airs but do not bear fruit. Those who look like they should be fruit bearers, but when you get down to inspection time, there's no fruit. And Jesus has no patience with that. I mean, it wasn't, he said, well, I'll come back tomorrow and see. He wasn't like the vineyard keeper that we read about in the New Testament, where he tried all of these different things. You know, the guy that was his sharecropper said, you know, well, let me try this, and let me try this, and let me try this. And he kept saying, no, I just want to wipe out the place. You know, it's not good. And he kept saying, let me try this. Jesus didn't say, well, let me try something else. He just said, hey, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. Well, the next thing that I want us to look at is bad fruit and fruitlessness brings reprisal. We've just seen a little bit of that in Mark. But let's go back to Isaiah chapter 5 and look at verses 4 and 5 here. God says to Jerusalem and Judah, "What more could I have done for my vineyard than I did? Why, when I expected a yield of good grapes, did it yield worthless grapes? Now, I will tell you what I'm about to do to my vineyard. I'm going to remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will tear down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland. It will not be pruned or weeded. Thorns and briars will grow up. I will also give orders to the clouds that rain should not fall on it." God's grace had been lavished on the children of Israel in a number of ways. In his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That was the grace of God. They weren't doing anything to get that. You remember those were what we called unilateral covenants, which meant that God alone made the promise. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't do anything except receive the promise. It didn't depend upon their behavior or their activity or anything like that. So his grace had been lavished on them in that way. His grace had been lavished on them in getting them out of Egypt after 430 to 50 years, somewhere in that neighborhood. And then his grace had been lavished on them as they go through the wilderness. As they need water, he provides water. They need food, he provides food. They don't like the food he provides a different kind of food. He continues to pour out his grace on Israel, and still the Israelites produced worthless grapes. And God says, "What more could I have done? I mean, what do you want?" He could ask the same question of America, couldn't he? We sing, "America, America, God shed his grace on thee," don't we? And we only do that on patriotic days. and when we sing that, we probably don't think about what that is saying. We are the world's longest standing democratic society. None other has stood this long. We have unprecedented wealth. We have unprecedented freedoms that people elsewhere look at and wish that they had. And yet, we don't acknowledge God in our schools. We don't acknowledge God in our halls of government. We don't acknowledge God in some of our churches even. And we don't acknowledge God in our homes. And the home was the center part of things in Scripture. We are producing, if you will, worthless grapes. If we are God's vineyard, we are producing worthless grapes. We are one generation away from being a totally pagan nation. And that's not long. It won't take long. We're getting to the point where people will not call America a Christian nation much longer, if they do even now. Go back over, I told you to keep your finger in there, to John chapter 15. And in John chapter 15, verse 2, we read it just a moment ago, Jesus says, "Every branch in me that does not produce fruit, he removes." Okay? We have a branch that is in the vine that is receiving sustenance from the vine, but is not producing good fruit. And Jesus said, every branch that doesn't produce fruit, what does God do? He lops it off. Now, why does he lop it off? He lops it off so that the other vines can benefit from the sustenance. Let's see what he does with the other vines. He prunes every branch that produces fruit so that it will produce more fruit. Now, the pruning process, I have a little book called Lessons from a Venetian Vine Grower that is based on this John chapter 15. And it goes through and talks about how the vine dresser goes in among there, and some vines he will take and he will wrap them around other vines. Some he will tie up. Some he cuts off and he throws over in a pile over there, and they're to be taken off and burned because they're no good. But he will take hours and hours and hours going down a row of in his vineyard, doing this so that they will produce good fruit. Fruitlessness is against everything that God is for. Fruitfulness is God's primary and his redemptive purpose for all of mankind. In verses 5 and 6, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who remains in me, and I in him produces much fruit. What does it mean to remain in the vine? Stay attached, be healthy, and be productive, or not productive, but be there where you can bear the fruit. If anyone does not remain in me, he is thrown aside like a branch and he withers. They gather them up, throw them into the fire, and they are burned. Now, this is not talking about losing your salvation. It's talking about people who are, well, let's just talk about there are people who are in the church, may have been in the church for years and years and years, have benefited from the church, but have never, ever, ever come into a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And there will be some of those who hear those unfortunate words, depart from me, I never knew you, when the day comes. So God expects fruit. Now let's go back to Mark chapter 11. In Mark chapter 11, drop down to verse 13, if you will. The 13b, rather, the latter part. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. Now, you know, that makes you know that Jesus was not an agronomist, because he didn't know that it wasn't the season for figs. He was going on the looks, on the outer thing, you know. And a lot of us do that. We judge people, do we not, on the way they look, the way they act, the way they dress, the way they speak. We judge them on the outer things without getting to know the inner person, without getting to know who they really are. And so Jesus did this with a fig tree, if you will. He looked at it, he said, ought to be there. But it wasn't the season for figs. I'm not really sure why Mark put that in there. But I think he wanted to make a point at that particular time. And he said, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And then look what happened next. This is amazing. Drop down to verse 20, if you will. Early in the morning, this is another day later, as they were passing by, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots up. Then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. Wow. Jesus cursed the fig tree that did not have figs, even though it was not fig season, because it looked like it should have figs. It was acting like there should be figs, but there were no figs. What do you think he thinks when he looks in the church and he sees people who look like they ought to be Christ followers, who even say things that sound like Christ followers, but there is no fruit in their life? Now, I used to hear it said, and you may have heard this said also, the fruit of a Christian is another Christian. I don't think that's altogether true. I think it's true to an extent, but I think the fruit of a Christian is another disciple, because we are given the commission to go and make disciples. And people who go out and get notches on their spiritual gun belt by just throwing out the gospel willy-nilly are like the sower who did not prepare the soils before he threw it out there. And so some of the seed was just wasted, if you will. We have a responsibility, and part of the responsibility of making disciples is preparing the soil of their lives so that they're receptive not only to the good news of the gospel, but also to growing to be like Jesus. Now, why would I say that? The disciples were disciples before they were followers, or believers, if you will. They were followers, but believers. When did they become believers? Hmm? After the resurrection. They said, oh, oh, now we get it. We didn't know what he was talking about before. Now we get it. They had been followers all along. They had been disciples all along, disciples of a rabbi. The rabbi was Jesus, and they had followed his teaching and everything, but they didn't get it. So discipleship both precedes and follows conversion. We prepare the soil, we prepare the ground, and we want to get it to the point where the ground will produce good grapes. This is what God was talking about with Jerusalem and Judah. He said, I loved this place. I fixed it up. I spent all the time to clear the ground, to build the tower, to build the wine press and all this stuff. And all I expected were good grapes. And I didn't get them. I don't think Jesus will take it lightly when we meet him if we have nothing to present to him. You remember the parable of the talents? The king was going out of town, the landowner, whomever it was going out of town. He called in 3 of his servants. He says to one, okay, here you go. Here is 1 talent for you. You take that, and I'm going to be gone for a while. And then another one he gave 2, another one he gave 5. And then he came back after a while. We don't know how long a while he was gone. It was a good while, though. And when he came back, the guy with the 5 came in and he said, look, you gave me 5. I went out, I invested these, I used them, I worked, and I've got 5 more for you. You remember what the master said? Enter into the joys of my kingdom. You've been faithful over this. I'm going to give you more responsibility, and you're going to be a key man in my operation here. And the guy with 2 comes in and he said, you gave me 2, and I have 2 more. And he says, I'm proud of you. Come on in. You know, you're going to enjoy being on the inside of the business here. So you see, it doesn't make any difference where God makes you a 5-talent person or a 2-talent person. He just wants a return on his investment. Look at what the first guy did. Came in, he has a little baggie, and it has little dingles of dirt hanging off of it. And he said, well, I knew that you were a tough businessman. And so I took my talent and I buried it in the backyard. And I dug it up and I brought it to here it is. Do you remember what the king or the master said to him at that time? You are a wicked, evil person. And he said, come and get this guy and tie him up and throw him into outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And take what he had and give it who had 5. God expects fruit from our lives. When he doesn't get it, he is upset. Well, back, if you will, to Isaiah again, and let's look down at verse 7 in Isaiah chapter 5. For the vineyard of the Lord of armies is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah, the plant he delighted in. He expected justice, but saw injustice. He expected righteousness, but heard cries of despair. Okay, now he is identifying the fruit. Before he said good grapes and worthless grapes. Now he's identifying what the fruit is. It has nothing to do with grapes at all. It has to do with justice. It has to do with righteousness. Those were the things that he was expecting. Since we are grafted into the branch of Israel, we're included in the expectations of God. He expects some things for us. You don't have to turn there, but in 2 Corinthians 6:1, Paul warns, don't receive the grace of God in vain. Now, there are 2 kinds of grace. There's one that is called common grace. And that is like the sun shines on everybody. The rain falls on everybody. We have air to breathe. We all do, whether we're believers or non-believers. That's common grace. That's something that God gives to everything. Then there is special grace that is given to those who receive Christ. By grace you are saved through faith. And that is a very special thing. And Paul says, hey, don't receive the grace of God in vain. If you have heard the gospel and you've not responded to it, you've received the grace of God in vain. And what happens is there comes a time when your opportunity for receiving the grace of God passes. That little verse that always shakes me up in Genesis that says, my spirit will not always strive with man. God has a timetable for each of us. And he says, all right, you've had this opportunity, you've had this opportunity, you've had this opportunity. You did not take any of these opportunities. You have chosen instead to go your own way, to do your own thing, to disobey, to ignore my will, and to follow a lifestyle that you choose, not one that I choose. What we have to recognize is that we have a God-ordained responsibility to those who are around us. That we want to help them. We want to work with God in the vineyard to prepare everything so that the people are ready to receive the gospel. My brother and sister-in-law worked for 26 and a half years in Taiwan. And one of the things that they learned in Taiwan is in the Asian culture, nothing happens overnight. It takes years and years and years and years. And they kept saying, even to the people in our foreign mission board, international mission board, they kept saying to them, because they were saying, we want you to plant a church, then within X amount of time, we want you to turn that church over to an indigenous leader. Well, they were basing that on church planting in the U.S. It doesn't happen that way. It takes many, many more years of preparing the soil, of discipling the person before they're ready to take a leadership position. And so we need to be at work in the vineyard of God. We need to be preparing. Some of us need to be moving rocks. Some of us need to be cutting down thorns and thistles and throwing them out. Some of us will be assigned to prune the vines. We will have different assignments depending upon how God has created us and what He wants us to do. And we need to recognize that even those things that other people do not see may be the most important things that are done in preparing the vine to be productive and to bring forth good grapes. Remember what Jesus said when He said had the sheep on one side and the goats on the other side? And He said, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these. Because the people who had done the good things, and He was saying, hey, come and enter into my kingdom and enjoy everything. These people were saying, what'd we do? we don't ever remember seeing you hungry. We don't ever remember seeing you sick. We don't ever remember seeing you in jail. And He said, hey, when you did it for the guy down the street, when you did it for the kid that was at school that didn't have clothes and you bought some clothes for them, and they never knew it was you that did it, but you did that. When you bought a meal for somebody that didn't have it, when you did all of these things, when you did it for the least of these, you did it, Jesus said, for me. Bearing fruit is not an option for Christians. Bearing fruit is an indication that you're a Christian. If you're not, you're a sapsucker, if you will. You're just sucking the sap out of the vine, out of the branch, and you're not, the vine, and you're not bearing any fruit. Too many people in churches today are content to, what I think, the 3 S's, sit, soak, and sour. It's like a sponge. You take a sponge and you fill it with water and you sit it on your cabinet and you leave it there. After a while, it will begin to sour. Because a sponge does not exist just to take in water. It exists to take in water and to give out water, or liquid, or whatever it is that you soak up with it. The picture of the talents that we read just a moment ago is the picture of, I think, what God was talking about here through Isaiah when he was saying, you know, I did everything I could. I gave you the talents. I gave you the possibilities. I took care of setting up this vineyard and everything, and yet you produced worthless grapes. I come from a small town in Alabama, and our church in Alabama has produced countless pastors, missionaries, church staff members, and it's not a very big church. They're not in a very big place necessarily. And yet, years they have produced fruit, or they've borne fruit as God produced it through them. And I trust that they'll go on. This church right here could be productive that way. And we need to be. But what we need to recognize is that we have a responsibility to bear fruit. And Timothy will tell you that that's the way it should be. And that is probably the way God sounds when he looks at our fruitlessness in many cases. Don't let him be eaten up by skeeters out there. He's fine. He's fine. Just stand right there. So I want to encourage you, examine your lives and ask the Lord to show you if there's any fruit there. And ask the Lord what you need to do to cooperate with him so that you become a fruit-bearing vine. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you so much for your love. Lord Jesus, thank you for the fact that you love us so very much. And it's through you that we have experienced salvation. Make us aware of the fact that as believers, we have a responsibility. And our responsibility is to be at work in the vineyard and to be assured that we bear fruit as we are attached to the vine and receiving spiritual sustenance from you by your word and by your spirit. Speak to our hearts tonight as we sing. Let us know anything we need to do in response to the message you've given us tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Bob?